The Gilded Age unfolded at a moment when America was redefining itself. The Civil War had ended in 1865, and within a decade, a surge of industrial growth transformed the country. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 connected east to west. Oil fields in Pennsylvania fed the rise of Rockefeller's Standard Oil, and Andrew Carnegie's steel empire reshaped cities with bridges and skyscrapers. This was an age of raw capitalism, where fortune could be built in a single lifetime. Yet amid these triumphs of industry, the public imagination was captured less by steel mills and more by the spectacle of wealth displayed in private palaces. By the 1880s, New York's Fifth Avenue had become a corridor of excess. Mansions rose along the so-called Millionaires' Row, each designed to outshine its neighbor. The Astor family entertained in their grand double house on 65th Street. The Vanderbilts commissioned homes so vast that one guest remarked the dining room seemed large enough to seat the armies of Europe. In Newport, Rhode Island, the Breakers, completed in 1895 for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, sprawled with 70 rooms, marble imported from Italy, and ceilings painted to mimic Renaissance palaces. Every brick and gilded frame projected not just wealth, but permanence, as though these families had always belonged to the ranks of global aristocracy. But permanence was an illusion. Many of these fortunes were new, accumulated within a single generation. The families who built these palaces often felt the insecurity of their sudden rise. Old New York society, descended from Dutch and English settlers, looked down on the nouveau riche who made their money in railroads or oil. To gain legitimacy, the new elite imported European customs, lavish balls, carefully orchestrated dinners, and, most importantly, the employment of large domestic staffs. A house without servants was unthinkable for those seeking social acceptance. The size of these staffs was staggering. The Breakers required more than 40 servants to function smoothly, from butlers and cooks to stable boys and laundresses. The Biltmore estate in North Carolina, completed by George Washington Vanderbilt II in 1895, employed close to 60 indoor servants and an even greater number outdoors. In New York City, the 1883 Vanderbilt Ball, a legendary event of the family's Fifth Avenue mansion, relied on dozens of servants working in shifts throughout the night. Guests marveled at the spectacle of diamonds and silks, but the event's success hinged on unseen hand preparing, serving, and cleaning. Architectural blueprints from the period reveal how carefully invisibility was engineered. Mansions were constructed with separate servant corridors, narrow back staircases, and hidden passageways. At the Breakers, the basement was essentially a world unto itself. Sprawling kitchens, laundry rooms, and servant quarters were tucked away from the sight of guests. Speaking tube connected floors, and bell systems allowed residents to summon staff from almost any room. The design emphasized one principle, that wealth should appear effortless. Servants existed to ensure that guests never glimpsed the labor behind the spectacle. This invisibility mirrored broader trends in American society. Between 1870 and 1900, nearly 12 million immigrants entered the United States, many of them funneled into domestic service. Irish women in particular dominated the serving class, so much so that Bridget became a derogatory shorthand for a female domestic worker. German, Scandinavian, and later Italian immigrants filled roles as cooks, maids, and coachmen. In the South, African Americans, recently emancipated, often found that domestic service was the most accessible form of employment in urban centers. These groups shoulder the burden of elite life while navigating poverty, discrimination, and precariousness of employment. Life for servants was not only hidden but punishing. Records from the era describe workdays stretching from dawn until after midnight. A maid might rise before the household to light fires, hold water, and clean rooms before the family stirred. Cooks labored in sweltering kitchens, preparing elaborate meals that could stretch to 10 or 12 courses. Footmen stood for hours in stiff livery, carrying trays and opening doors with precision. Wages were low, hours were long, and free time was rare. Servants often slept in cramped attic rooms or basement quarters, far removed from the grandeur they maintained. Yet the system thrived because it served both sides. For the wealthy, servants guaranteed the illusion of refinement and ease. For the poor, domestic service offered a livelihood, however meager. Letters from immigrant servants reveal a mixture of resentment and gratitude, frustration at long hours, yet relief at a steady wage compared to factory work. But the system also entrenched hierarchies. Servants were expected to be invisible not only in the house but in society, excluded from the narratives of prosperity that defined the Gilded Age. The public image of wealth rarely acknowledged this hidden workforce. Newspapers celebrated the Vanderbilt Ball of 1883, where guests wore costumes worth thousands of dollars, yet there was no mention of the cooks who prepared meals or the maids who worked late into the night cleaning the aftermath. The New York Times detailed the splendor of Alva Vanderbilt parties, describing gowns, jewels, and decorations, but omitted the logistics that made such spectacles possible. To acknowledge the servants would have been to puncture the illusion of effortless luxury. But the servants themselves left traces. In rare diaries and oral histories, they described the contradictions of their position. They witnessed private quarrels, overheard business dealings, and sometimes even became confidants of their employers. Yet discretion was paramount. A servant who spoke too freely risked dismissal. This culture of silence ensured that the image of the elite remained intact, even when the reality behind the curtains was far less polished. The illusion of grandeur extended beyond the household into the very fabric of society. The wealthy used their palaces and their servants as instruments of social competition. A poorly executed dinner could damage a family's reputation. Servants, though invisible, played a critical role in these contests. A butler who mismanaged wine service or a maid who mishandled linens might inadvertently tarnish the standing of a household. Thus, the performance of wealth was inseparable from the labor of those in the shadows. As the century turned, cracks began to appear in the system. Domestic service became less appealing as industrial jobs offered higher wages and shorter hours. Immigrants who once filled servant roles found better opportunities in factories or small businesses. At the same time, social reformers began to question the excesses of the Gilded Age. The progressive era exposed the inequalities beneath the surface, and the image of the servant-staffed mansion became a symbol of imbalance. By the 1920s, technological advances, electric lighting, central heating, and modern appliances reduced reliance on large domestic staffs. The world of the Gilded Age mansion, with its hidden corridors and silent armies of servants, faded into history. But during its height, the illusion was absolute. Guests entering the marble halls of the breakers or dining under the chandeliers of Fifth Avenue never saw the kitchens below or the cramped quarters above. They marveled at the shine of polished silver without thinking of the hours it took to achieve that gleam. They applauded hosts for their refinement without acknowledging the labor that made refinement possible. The Gilded Age was a performance, and servants were the stagehands, ensuring that the show ran smoothly, their presence essential yet unseen. In retrospect, the Gilded Age can be understood as a dual reality. On the surface, it was an era of unprecedented wealth and cultural ambition. But beneath, it was sustained by an underclass whose contributions were systematically erased from the narrative. Servants were the invisible foundation of a golden world. Without them, the illusion would have crumbled. And though history often remembers the chandeliers, the marble, and the diamonds, it is equally defined by the unseen hands that polished, cared, cleaned, and endured. The architecture of the Gilded Age was built to impress. From the moment a guest approached the towering facades of Fifth Avenue mansions or the summer palaces of Newport, every detail was designed to overwhelm. Columns soared, marble gleamed, and elaborate ironwork adorned entrances meant to symbolize permanence and refinement. Yet, for all the grandeur visible from the street, there existed another system of doors, staircases, and corridors hidden in plain sight. These spaces, rarely seen by visitors, were the arteries of the house, the servant entrances. They were not designed to impress, but to conceal. They embodied the stark social divisions of the age, ensuring that the illusion of effortless wealth remained undisturbed by the sight of labor. The idea of a separate servant entrance was not an American invention. Wealthy Americans of the late 19th century consciously modeled their homes on European aristocratic estates. In Britain, the backdoor tradition had been entrenched for centuries, with grand country houses constructed to separate the movements of staff from those of their employers. When industrial fortunes in the United States created a new class of millionaires, these families eagerly imported both the architecture and the etiquette of Europe. Architects such as Richard Morris Hunt and Stanford White, commissioned to design Vanderbilt or Aestia mansions, carefully incorporated dual systems of circulation, one for the family and their guests, another for the servants who made the house function. In practice, this meant that a single mansion might contain two parallel worlds. Guests arriving at a Vanderbilt mansion would pass through a front entrance flanked by columns, greeted by butlers in immaculate livery. Servants, meanwhile, used discreet side doors or basement passages. At the breakers, Cornelius Vanderbilt II's Newport estate, a separate service court was tucked out of sight. Deliveries of coal, food, and linens arrived through these hidden routes, ensuring that the grandeur of the front drive remained untouched by the dirt and noise of everyday labor. Once inside, the separation continued. Servant staircases, often narrow and windowless, wound through the house, connecting kitchens, pantries, and laundry rooms to the formal spaces above. These staircases were deliberately placed to avoid overlap with the main halls. A guest strolling through a marble gallery would never see the maid hurrying up the back stairs to change linens, or the footman carrying wood for the fireplaces. The design itself encoded the invisibility of the working class, turning architecture into a social barrier. The reliance on these hidden routes spoke to the anxieties of the elite. Wealth in the Gilded Age was new and often precarious in its legitimacy. Families like the Vanderbilts, whose fortune came from railroads, faced criticism from older social circles who saw them as parvenus, newcomers to society. To counter this, they embraced rituals of refinement, insisting on a lifestyle that appeared polished and effortless. Any sign of the machinery behind that performance threatened the illusion. Servant entrances ensured that the gears of wealth turned unseen. For the servants themselves, these entrances were a reminder of their place in the hierarchy. Many enter the house only through the basement or side doors, never permitted to use the front. Their physical path through the house mirrored their social position, always behind, beneath, or out of sight. This spatial segregation extended to their quarters. While families occupied ornate suites with carved wood paneling and gilded mirrors, servants often slept in attic rooms or basement dormitories. The contrast reinforced the boundaries of class, visible in stone and mortar. Technology amplified this separation. By the 1880s, elaborate bell systems were common in elite homes. Buttons in drawing rooms or bedrooms connected to panels in the servants' quarters, where small bells or indicators signaled which room required attention. At the breakers, a complex system of call buttons allowed family members to summon staff without ever leaving their seats. In other homes, speaking tubes carried voices from one floor to another. These devices reduced the need for direct contact, ensuring that the presence of servants remained discreet, their movements coordinated silently through the architecture itself. The symbolism of the servant entrance extended beyond convenience. It communicated values. In an age obsessed with appearances, the wealthy were acutely aware of how they and their homes were perceived. A coal delivery cart blocking the front drive, or a line of maids carrying laundry through the main hall, would disrupt the carefully cultivated image of refinement. Servant entrances allowed the household to function without exposing the physical reality of labor. The illusion was maintained not only by the work of servants, but by their absence from the visual field of guests. Historical accounts from the period reveal how strictly these boundaries were enforced. In households with dozens of servants, rules dictated which doors they could use, which hallways they could cross, and even how they should move through the house. A butler might be allowed in the main dining room, but a scullery maid would rarely be seen outside the kitchen. These unwritten codes reflected the rigid hierarchies of service, where rank determined visibility. The architecture supported these divisions, channeling movement so that lower-ranking staff remained entirely out of sight. The cultural meaning of these divisions was profound. In the late 19th century, the United States was experiencing massive social upheaval. Immigration, urbanization, and industrialization created new forms of inequality. The servant entrance became a microcosm of these divides. It was a physical reminder that while the wealthy displayed their fortunes publicly, the labor of immigrants, African Americans, and the working poor was relegated to basements and side corridors. The nation celebrated its progress, yet within the walls of its grandest homes, it replicated systems of exclusion and hierarchy. Accounts from Newport society illustrate this duality vividly. Guests arriving for the Vanderbilt Ball of 1883 marveled at the spectacle of the hosts, who spent the equivalent of millions of dollars on costumes, decorations, and entertainment. Yet historians estimate that dozens of servants worked unseen throughout the event, moving in and out of back corridors to ensure that champagne was poured, trays circulated, and lights remained glowing late into the night. None of these workers appeared in newspaper descriptions of the event, though without them the party could not have functioned. The separation also carried psychological weight. For servants, entering through the back door was a daily reminder of their invisibility. Some memoirs describe feelings of alienation, as workers lived inside the most extravagant homes of their age yet remained outsiders within them. They touched fine silver but never owned it, walked marble halls but slept in cramped quarters, and watched luxury unfold without participating in it. The servant entrance symbolized this paradox, a gateway into the world of the wealthy, but one that kept them always at its edges. By the early 20th century, the design of houses began to shift. As technology advanced and domestic service declined, the need for vast servant corridors diminished. Apartments and smaller homes reduced the scale of domestic staff, and the architectural duality softened. Yet the legacy of the servant entrance remains visible in the surviving mansions of the Gilded Age. Walking through these estates today, visitors can still trace the narrow staircases and hidden passages that once carried the lifeblood of the household. They reveal a world carefully constructed to preserve appearances, to separate labor from leisure, and to maintain the illusion of effortless grandeur. The servant entrance was more than a door. It was a symbol of the Gilded Age itself, an era defined by glittering surfaces and hidden realities. Just as America presented itself as a land of prosperity while grappling with inequality, the mansion presented itself as a palace of ease while concealing the labor that sustained it. To step through the servant's entrance was to enter the truth of the Gilded Age, a world built on division, invisibility, and the unacknowledged work of those who made luxury possible. The Gilded Age mansion was not only a palace for its owners. It was also a miniature society within its walls, one that mirrored the class structures of the outside world. Beneath the chandeliers and velvet drapes, in kitchens, hallways, and cramped servant quarters, another hierarchy ruled, the strict order of domestic service. Every servant knew their place, every role had its boundaries, and together they formed a human machine that allowed the house to function. To understand life below stairs is to see how deeply the ideals of class and order were etched into the daily lives of those who worked in America's most opulent homes. At the top of this hidden society stood the butler. More than just a servant, the butler embodied the dignity of the household. He oversaw the wine cellar, the silver, and the dining room. During grand dinners, it was his presence, calm, authoritative, and discreet, that maintained order. In the Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, or the A.S. Steer house on 65th Street, the butler was often the first servant a guest encountered, greeting arrivals with a formal bow. He carried the authority of his employer and commanded the staff beneath him. For many households, the butler symbolized stability, a figure who could serve the same family for decades, quietly witnessing marriages, scandals, and fortunes rise and fall. Below the butler were the footmen, easily recognizable by their livery. Dressed in tailored coats and white gloves, they carried trays, poured wine, and stood behind chairs at dinner. Their role was not only functional but symbolic. Footmen added an air of aristocratic refinement, evoking the traditions of English country houses. For this reason, tall, well-built young men were often preferred, their physical presence reinforcing the grandeur of the setting. Yet beneath the polish, their lives were hard. They worked long hours, rehearsing the precise timing of service, and endured the strain of standing for hours during banquet that stretched late into the night. In the kitchen, the center of activity, another hierarchy existed. The cook or chef held a powerful position, commanding the staff who prepared meals for elaborate 12-course dinners. In the grandest houses, wealthy families sometimes hired French chefs, whose reputations added luster to their tables. A chef's skill could elevate a household's social standing, as society pages often commented on the quality of meals served at elite parties. Beneath the cook were kitchen maids, scullery maids, and errand boys, each with tasks that ranged from chopping vegetables to scrubbing pots until the early hours of the morning. The scullery maid, often the lowest-ranking servant, endured some of the harshest conditions, endless washing in steaming water, little recognition, and almost no opportunity for advancement. Female servants made up the majority of the workforce in most households. Maids were divided into strict categories. The ladies maid attended to the mistress of the house, managing wardrobes, pressing gowns, and assisting with elaborate hairstyles. She occupied a privileged position, often privy to personal confidences and family secrets. Housemaids handled cleaning, polishing, and maintaining the endless surfaces of marble, wood, and gilt that filled the rooms upstairs. Parlor maids, who dusted and arranged drawing rooms, sometimes interacted directly with guests, but were expected to do so silently and unobtrusively. Each role carried its own status, and servants often measured themselves against one another as much as against their employers. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the youngest and most vulnerable, the hall boys and scullery maids. Often teenagers, they performed the most menial tasks, cleaning boots, carrying coal, hauling water, while enduring long hours and little pay. Their positions were stepping stones, but the path upward was narrow. Advancement depended on endurance, discretion, and sometimes sheer luck. Many left service altogether, seeking factory work or other employment that, while grueling, offered more autonomy. The boundaries between roles were not only about labor but about visibility. High-ranking servants like butlers and ladies' maids were allowed to appear in front of the family and their guests, while lower-ranking staff were confined to kitchens, basements, or back corridors. This division reflected a deeper truth. Even within the servant class, invisibility was a measure of status. The closer one came to the family, the higher one's rank, the more hidden one's work, the lower the position. In this way, the hierarchy below stairs reproduced the very divisions of the Gilded Age itself, a world in which visibility and privilege were inseparable. The structure also reinforced loyalty and discipline. Every servant reported to someone above them. The butler answered directly to the master of the house, the housekeeper to the mistress, and below them cascaded a chain of authority. The housekeeper, in particular, was a formidable figure. She managed female servants, assigned tasks, kept records of supplies, and ensured that rooms met exacting standards. In some households, the housekeeper's keys were a symbol of her authority. She held access to storerooms, linens, and valuables. To cross her was to risk dismissal. In memoirs from the period, servants often spoke of the housekeeper with a mix of fear and respect, acknowledging her power within the domestic world. Wages reflected these divisions. A butler might earn a respectable salary, sometimes equivalent to skilled tradesmen, while a scullery maid received a fraction of that amount. But money was not the only measure of status. The prestige of one's position carried weight. To be a lady's maid or a chef was to hold a role of pride, even if the hours were demanding. To be a hall boy or kitchen maid was to live in drudgery, often overlooked even by fellow servants. These distinctions created their own culture of ambition, competition, and resentment within the servant quarters. The hierarchies below stairs were not unique to America. They echoed the rigid structures of European aristocratic households. But in the United States, they intersected with the unique dynamics of immigration and race. Irish women often dominated the ranks of maids, while German or Scandinavian immigrants frequently worked in kitchens or as butlers. African American men and women, particularly in the South and in Washington, D.C., found domestic service one of the few accessible forms of employment, yet faced racial prejudice that limited advancement. Even within the servant hierarchy, the broader inequalities of American society shaped who could rise and who remained at the bottom. Despite these divisions, servants formed communities of their own. In kitchens and dormitories, they shared stories, gossip about employers, and sometimes formed alliances to ease the burden of their wealth. The hierarchy was rigid, but it was also human. Rivalries coexisted with friendships, and in moments of crisis, servants often depended on one another more than on the families they served. Oral histories describe how shared meals in the servants' hall became a brief respite, a time to rest and connect before returning to the relentless demands of the household. The strict order below stairs was essential to the illusion above. A grand dinner, a ball, or even the daily running of a mansion required precision. If the butler failed to coordinate footmen, if the housemaid did not polish surfaces, if the scullery maid lagged behind in her washing, the illusion of effortless grandeur would falter. Each servant, no matter how low in rank, played a role in sustaining the image of aristocratic ease. The hierarchy was not merely about control. It was about efficiency, ensuring that the machinery of wealth operated smoothly, unseen by guests. By the turn of the century, this system began to strain. Servants increasingly left domestic service for industrial jobs with shorter hours and more independence. Families struggled to recruit and retain staff, even as they clung to traditions of grandeur. The rigid hierarchy below stairs, once a symbol of stability, began to look outdated in a rapidly changing world. Yet during the height of the Gilded Age, it defined the daily reality of countless workers, shaping their lives in ways that history too often forgets. The hierarchy below stairs was a reflection of the age itself, an America glittering with opportunity on the surface, yet marked by deep inequalities and rigid divisions beneath. Servants live within this contradiction every day, embodying both the invisibility of labor and its absolute necessity. Their lives remind us that the grandeur of the Gilded Age was not a natural fact, but a carefully constructed illusion, an illusion sustained by order, discipline, and the human hierarchies that echoed far beyond the walls of the mansion. The rhythm of a Gilded Age mansion was relentless, a carefully orchestrated performance that began before the first rays of light touched the ornate facades of Fifth Avenue or Newport. While the families upstairs slept in canopied beds beneath painted ceilings, servants were already at work. Their days stretched from before dawn until long after midnight, a cycle of labor that rarely paused, sustained by discipline, routine, and the constant demand for perfection. To glimpse a servant's day is to see the machinery behind the velvet curtains, the unending labor that kept the illusion of effortless wealth alive. The first to rise were often the scullery maids and hall boys. Around 4 or 5 in the morning, while the city outside was still silent, they moved through darkened kitchens and corridors. Fires needed to be lit in the grates, coal scuttles filled, and water hauled. In an era before central heating and electric stoves, the sheer physical labor of preparing a house for the day was immense. At the breakers in Newport, for example, fireplaces stretched across dozens of rooms. Each had to be cleaned of ash, laid with fresh coal or wood, and lit before the family awoke. A hall boy, often no older than 15, could spend hours carrying fuel up narrow servant staircases, his work unseen but essential. By 6 o'clock, the kitchens came alive. The cook, sometimes aided by several assistants, began preparing breakfast. In the largest households, menus were elaborate even for the first meal of the day: eggs, bacon, breads, fruit, and coffee for the family, often accompanied by separate trays for children or guests. Servants' meals were prepared at the same time, but were simpler, made from leftovers or cheaper ingredients. The scullery maids washed pans and dishes almost continuously, their hands raw from hot water and soap. The smell of baking bread or frying bacon might drift upward, but the family rarely considered the labor below that made their morning effortless. While the kitchen bustled, the housemaid began their rounds. Their task was to clean and prepare the bedrooms and living spaces before the family stirred. This meant sweeping, dusting, and arranging rooms so that they appeared untouched by labor. In households with dozens of rooms, the sheer scale was daunting. Every surface had to shine, from marble mantles to gilded mirrors. Beds were stripped and remade, chamber pots emptied, rugs beaten, and wood polished. Timing was critical. Maids often rushed to finish before the first members of the family descended, ensuring that the illusion of a pristine house was preserved. By mid-morning, the family might take breakfast in a formal dining room. Here, the butler and footman took over. Footmen served each dish with practiced precision, pouring coffee and setting plates with quiet efficiency. The butler oversaw the process, ensuring that service flowed seamlessly. Guests marveled at the smoothness of the ritual, but few considered the hours of preparation and training behind it. For the servants, breakfast was only the beginning. After the family dined, the day shifted into a steady rhythm of cleaning, cooking, and maintenance. In the laundry rooms, maids scrubbed clothing, linens, and tablecloths by hand, a task that consumed hours each day. In wealthy households, linens were changed daily, and uniforms for servants required constant washing and pressing. Ironing alone could occupy several workers, using heavy irons heated on stoves. In the stables, coachmen and grooms tended to horses, polished carriages, and prepared for trips into the city. Even as automobiles appeared in the early 20th century, many elite families clung to horses as symbols of tradition, adding to the workload of their staff. Midday meals required another round of preparation. Luncheons could be elaborate, particularly if guests were present. Servants laid out polished silverware and china, each piece placed according to strict rules of etiquette. The kitchen prepared multiple courses. From soups to roasts, each dish carried to the table in order. Again, the family and their guests experienced refinement, while downstairs the staff worked in sweltering conditions, timing each course with precision. Afternoons often brought new tasks. Maids might sew or repair garments, polish silver, or prepare rooms for evening events. Governesses, in families that employed them, spent hours with children, teaching lessons or supervising play. For families hosting social gatherings, preparations began early. Ballrooms had to be swept, candles or electric lights checked, and flowers arranged. At the height of the season, when New York or Newport society hosted constant parties, servants could find themselves working almost without pause. Dinner was the centerpiece of the day. In the wealthiest households, it was a ritual that could last several hours, often involving up to 12 courses. Preparation began in the morning, with chefs sourcing fresh ingredients and kitchen staff spending hours on elaborate dishes. By evening, the dining room glittered with polished silver and crystal. Footmen stood behind trays, refilling glasses and clearing plates in silence. The butler coordinated timing, ensuring that courses appeared seamlessly. Guests marveled at the abundance, the artistry of presentation, and the refinement of service. Yet behind each plate lay hours of labor, the cook's precision, the scullery maid's endless washing, the footman's training. For the servants, dinner was both the most visible and the most exhausting moment of the day. They moved quickly but silently, their presence acknowledged only when service faltered. Mistakes could be costly. Spilled wine, mistimed courses, or clumsy service could damage not only a servant position, but the reputation of the household itself. Once the final course was served, the work continued. Dishes had to be washed, tablecloths laundered, and the dining room restored for the next day. Evenings often brought additional duties. Families hosted balls, concerts, or receptions that stretched late into the night. At Alva Vanderbilt's famous masquerade ball in 1883, hundreds of guests filled the mansion, dressed in elaborate costumes. Servants worked in shifts to keep trays circulating, candles lit, and the flow of guests uninterrupted. For them, the grandeur was not a spectacle but a grueling test of endurance. Many did not retire to their quarters until well past midnight, only to rise again before dawn. The physical toll of such days was immense. Servants' hands bore the marks of labor, burns from stoves, blisters from hauling coal, raw skin from endless washing. Feet ached from hours of standing, and backs strained from carrying heavy trays and buckets. Rest was limited. Servants' quarters were often cramped, with shared rooms and little privacy. A scullery maid might share an attic room with several others, her only respite a narrow bed before the next day began. Yet within this rhythm, there were moments of solidarity. Shared meals in the servants' hall offered brief respite, a chance to exchange stories or laughter before returning to duty. Hierarchies remained, but camaraderie softened the grind. Oral histories from former servants reveal that these moments of connection sustained them through long days. The cycle of dawn to midnight defined a Gilded Age household. For the families upstairs, life appeared effortless, a seamless flow of meals, cleanliness, and entertainment. For the servants below, it was a relentless performance, sustained by discipline and labor. Every day, the pattern repeated, with little variation, reinforcing the illusion that wealth required no effort. By the early 20th century, this cycle began to break down. As industrial jobs became more attractive, fewer workers were willing to endure the long hours and rigid discipline of domestic service. Labor-saving devices, electric lighting, central heating, and household appliances reduced the need for constant attention. But during the height of the Gilded Age, the daily life of servants remained an unending march from dawn to midnight, invisible to those who relied on it. This daily rhythm reveals the essence of the Gilded Age illusion. Wealth was not effortless. It was manufactured every day through labor that went unseen. Behind each glittering ballroom and polished dining table lay hours of unseen work. The families upstairs may have believed in the myth of ease, but the servants knew the truth. From dawn to midnight, they lived it. The Gilded Age household was a world of spectacle above, but of strict discipline below. Servants lived under a regime of rules that governed not only their work but their behavior, speech, and even their private lives. To step into service was to accept an unwritten contract, loyalty in exchange for livelihood, silence in exchange for survival. In the shadows of chandeliers and marble staircases, discipline was a currency that maintained order, ensuring that the machinery of luxury never faltered. The most immediate form of discipline came from the rules of the house itself. Large households operated like small armies, each servant assigned precise tasks and schedules. A butler oversaw the male staff, the housekeeper directed the women, and beneath them cascaded a hierarchy of authority. Orders flowed downward, discipline upward. Every servant understood where they stood, what was expected, and what could never be tolerated. Failure meant not just reprimand, but the threat of dismissal, a terrifying prospect in an era when jobs were scarce and reputations followed workers from one household to another. Rules extended far beyond work tasks. Silence was among the most sacred expectations. Servants saw and heard everything. Quarrels between spouses, indiscretions during grand parties, private conversations about money or politics. Yet discretion was absolute. A careless word could cost a career. Families demanded this silence because their reputations, so carefully curated in society, depended on it. Servants became the invisible guardians of these reputations, holding secrets they could never reveal. The unwritten contract of loyalty meant that even betrayal could not be spoken of. This expectation shaped the very culture of service, reinforcing the idea that invisibility was not just physical but moral. Uniforms were another form of discipline, binding servants to their roles. Butlers wore black tailcoats, footmen donned livery and house colors, and maids dressed in plain black gowns with crisp aprons. Uniforms stripped individuality, replacing it with the identity of the household. They reminded servants of their place and signaled their function to family and guests. To wear the livery was to subsume oneself into the machinery of the house, a visual contract that emphasized discipline and order. For employers, the uniform reinforced authority. For servants, it was both a badge of employment and a symbol of their constrained lives. Time itself was regulated with precision. Bells rang from speaking panels, summoning servants at all hours. A family's schedule determined the rhythm of the household, often stretching late into the night with dinners and parties. Servants adapted to irregular hours, living in constant readiness for the next demand. Discipline required not only obedience but anticipation. A good servant was one who anticipated needs before they were spoken, who appeared when summoned and disappeared when no longer required. This constant vigilance wore down body and mind, but it was part of the silent contract, invisibility and readiness in exchange for continued employment. Punishments reinforced these expectations. A servant caught stealing, drinking on duty, or speaking out of turn could be dismissed immediately, sometimes without wages. For immigrant workers, the loss of employment could mean destitution. Word spread quickly among employers, and a servant with a tarnished reputation might never find work again. The discipline of dismissal was powerful because it extended beyond one household. It marked a worker in the eyes of the entire servant community. This fear of disgrace maintained order more effectively than any written contract. Yet discipline was not only enforced by employers. It was internalized by servants themselves, who policed one another within the hierarchy below stays. A housemaid who shirked duties risked the anger of her colleagues, who had to pick up the slack. A footman who performed poorly embarrassed not just himself but the butler and the household. In this way, discipline became communal, enforced from within as much as from above. Servants measured one another by loyalty, discretion, and endurance, creating a culture where conformity was survival. Loyalty, however, was not one-sided. Many employers cultivated long-term relationships with trusted staff, rewarding loyalty with stability. A butler who served faithfully for decades might retire with a pension or recommendation. A lady's maid might remain with her mistress through marriage, widowhood, or travel, becoming a lifelong companion. These bonds created a sense of shared destiny, where the servant's identity became entwined with that of the family. For the wealthy, loyal servants were a status symbol, proof of their ability to command devotion. For servants, loyalty was both a shield and a burden, protecting them with security but binding them to lives of silence and subordination. The expectation of loyalty extended to private lives. Many households forbade romantic relationships between staff, fearing that distractions would reduce discipline. In some cases, employers dismissed servants who became pregnant or married without permission, claiming that their duties would suffer. Others required servants to remain unmarried as a condition of employment. Such restrictions blurred the line between professional and personal, extending control from the dining room to the most intimate aspect of a worker's life. To remain in service meant sacrificing not only time and labor but often autonomy over one's future. The immigrant experience amplified these silent contracts. For Irish women, who made up a large percentage of maids in cities like New York, domestic service was one of the few respectable jobs available. Wages were low, but the work offered room and board. Loyalty and silence became essential for survival in an unfamiliar country. German and Scandinavian immigrants often filled roles as cooks or butlers, bringing skills that gave them leverage, but even they were bound by a strict code of obedience. For African American servants, particularly in the South, discipline carried an added dimension of racial hierarchy. Their loyalty was often assumed, demanded as a continuation of the subjugation they had endured under slavery. In all cases, the rules of discipline revealed the deep inequalities of the age. Despite these constraints, servants were not without agency. Some resisted quietly, gossiping in kitchens, forming alliances, or leaving positions that became intolerable. Others used loyalty as leverage, negotiating better wages or conditions by proving themselves indispensable. The silent contract could be manipulated, but only at great risk. The balance of power remained heavily weighted toward employers, whose fortunes and social standing gave them immense authority over the lives of their staff. By the early 20th century, the silent contracts of discipline and loyalty began to fray. Industrial jobs offered independence and higher wages, attracting workers who once would have entered domestic service. Servant shortages forced employers to relax some rules or offer better pay. The rigid culture of discipline, once the backbone of Gilded Age households, slowly declined as social and economic changes reshaped labor. But during the height of the era, these contracts defined the lives of thousands, binding them in webs of obedience and silence that sustained the illusion of aristocratic ease. The story of these rules and loyalties is not just about control. It is about the hidden structures that made wealth appear effortless. Every polished floor, every silent dinner service, every secret kept behind closed doors depended on discipline. The loyalty of servants, extracted through fear, necessity, or devotion, was the foundation upon which the Gilded Age elite built their world. Without it, the illusion would have shattered. The silent contracts, though unwritten, were as powerful as any legal bond, shaping lives and preserving the grandeur of an age remembered for its glitter but built on invisible obedience. The Gilded Age was a period defined by extremes, staggering wealth on one end and relentless labor on the other. But within the walls of America's great mansions, these two worlds met daily in the form of relationships between servants and masters. The ties that bound them were paradoxical, intimate yet distant, loyal yet fragile, shaped by both necessity and inequality. These invisible bonds define the rhythm of domestic life. They reveal how two classes, separated by wealth and power, nevertheless depended on each other in ways that were complex, often contradictory, and deeply human. At the heart of these bonds was proximity. Servants lived inside the very homes they worked in, their presence woven into every aspect of their employers' lives. A lady's maid might be the first person a mistress saw each morning and the last before she went to bed, dressing her in elaborate gowns, arranging her hair, and listening as she spoke of personal matters. A butler not only oversaw meals and wine, but also became a fixture at every social occasion, from quiet family dinners to extravagant balls. Governesses, though technically employees, often formed emotional ties with the children they taught, sometimes becoming more constant figures in their lives than their own parents. This closeness blurred the line between employer and servant, creating bonds that could feel almost familial, but never equal. Historical records illustrate the depth of these connections. In memoirs written by former ladies' maids, stories emerge of employers confiding secrets about marriages, finances, or social rivalries. A mistress might trust her maid with information she would never share with her peers, precisely because the maid's silence was assumed. Similarly, butlers sometimes acted as informal advisors, their years of service giving them insights into the household's rhythms and the personalities within it. Trust, once established, could last for decades. Some servants remained with a single family for generations, their loyalty rewarded with pensions or positions for their children. Yet intimacy was shaped by hierarchy. However close a bond, servants never forgot their place. They addressed employers formally, deferred to their wishes, and lived under the constant reminder that their security depended on continued obedience. Even affection was constrained by the boundaries of class. A child might feel deep love for a nurse or governess, but when adulthood came, that bond often dissolved into polite distance. Servants, no matter how trusted, remained outsiders in the very households they sustained. The dynamic could also turn darker. Proximity meant that servants witnessed the private failings of their employers, affairs, quarrels, drunkenness, or financial troubles. Their silence protected reputations, but it also placed them in precarious positions. A servant who knew too much could be both invaluable and dangerous. Employers sometimes dismissed staff abruptly to prevent gossip from spreading, regardless of years of loyal service. This precariousness reinforced the fragility of trust. Servants were indispensable, yet disposable. Gender often shaped these bonds in profound ways. Ladies, maids, and governesses experienced a level of intimacy with their mistresses and charges that male servants rarely encountered. They handled delicate clothing, assisted with personal grooming, and spent hours in private rooms. But this closeness also left them vulnerable. Cases of harassment or inappropriate advances by male employers were not uncommon, though rarely documented openly. For male servants, particularly footmen and coachmen, the dynamic was different. Their visibility in uniforms and livery made them symbols of their employer's prestige, but it also placed them under constant scrutiny. Any breach of decorum could tarnish the household's image, and their personal interactions with employers were tightly controlled. Race and ethnicity added further layers of complexity. African American servants in northern households often lived in paradoxical relationships with employers who depended on their loyalty but regarded them with prejudice. In the South, the bond between white families and black domestic workers carried the weight of slavery's legacy. Immigrant servants, especially Irish women, who filled countless maid positions, often endured stereotypes and discrimination even as they became essential to the functioning of wealthy households. These dynamics reveal how loyalty and dependence were entangled with the broader inequalities of American society. Examples from prominent families illustrate these contradictions. The Ayers, one of New York's leading dynasties, employed large staffs in their Fifth Avenue mansion. Servants that were known for their precision and loyalty, yet oral history suggests that they also bore witness to the family's intense rivalries and struggles for social dominance. At the Breakers in Newport, Cornelius Vanderbilt II staff lived in close quarters with the family, yet moved through separate staircases and corridors, their presence felt but rarely acknowledged. These households relied on bonds of trust, but always within invisible boundaries. The nature of these bonds also reflected economic realities. For many servants, loyalty was not just a virtue but a survival strategy. A reputation for discretion and devotion increased the likelihood of stable employment, recommendations, or even lifelong security. Some butlers and housekeepers retired with pensions provided by grateful employers, while others received small inheritances or gifts. Employers often saw these gestures as proof of mutual loyalty. But the power imbalance was clear. Security came at the price of subordination, and reward depended entirely on the employer's goodwill. There were also moments of resistance. Servants, though bound by loyalty, sometimes asserted their agency in subtle ways. They might withhold information, delay tasks, or quietly mock their employers in the privacy of the servants' hall. Gossip circulated among staff, creating networks of shared knowledge that counterbalanced the silence expected above. In rare cases, servants leveraged their knowledge, threatening to reveal secrets unless conditions improved. These acts were risky, but they demonstrate that the bonds of loyalty were never absolute. They existed within a web of negotiation, coercion, and compromise. The human side of these relationships cannot be overlooked. Children often grew up with deep affection for nurses and governesses, recalling them fondly in later life. Employers sometimes mourn the loss of long-serving staff, acknowledging their dedication in obituaries or family records. In these moments, the bond between servants and masters transcended mere employment. They reflected the emotional realities of living side by side, bound together in households where public performance and private life intertwined. By the early 20th century, these bonds began to shift. As domestic service declined and new forms of employment emerged, the intimate yet unequal relationships of the Gilded Age grew rarer. Families adjusted to smaller staffs, reducing the constant presence of servants in their daily lives. The invisible bonds that once tied masters and servants began to fade, leaving behind memories and fragments in letters, diaries, and oral histories. Yet their legacy remained significant. The Gilded Age is often remembered for its success, its mansions, and its millionaires. But the story of the era is incomplete without acknowledging the relationships that sustained it. Servants were not only the invisible backbone of wealth, they were also human beings whose bond with their employers shaped the rhythm of life in America's grandest homes. These relationships were fraught with inequality, yet also rich with complexity, a testament to the ways humans connect even across the sharpest divides of class and power. In the second half of the 19th century, America's great mansions were filled not only with the glitter of wealth, but also with the voices of immigrants. Behind the polished silver and marble staircases, the majority of those who worked as servants were newcomers to the United States. Their journey often began in poverty and desperation, carried them across the Atlantic, and ended in the kitchens, laundries, and corridors of the Gilded Age elite. The story of immigration and servitude is inseparable from the story of the Gilded Age itself. The era's opulence was built not just on the fortunes of millionaires, but also on the labor of immigrants who sought survival and opportunity in a country that promised both, and delivered neither in equal measure. The largest single group of domestic servants in the Gilded Age came from Ireland. The Irish famine of the 1840s and 1850s had devastated the island, pushing millions to emigrate. By the 1870s and 1880s, Irish women dominated domestic service in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Census records show that in some neighborhoods, more than half of Irish-born women worked as maids, cooks, or laundresses. For these women, domestic service offered stability in a society that excluded them from many other professions. Factories often refused to hire Irish workers, and middle-class jobs were nearly impossible to obtain. Service became the gateway into American life. For many Irish women, domestic work was also a way to send money home. Letters from servants in New York and Boston describe remittances sent back to families in Ireland, helping younger siblings emigrate or supporting parents left behind. The wages were meager, but steady, and the room and board arrangement made it possible to save. Employers recognized this motivation and often exploited it, knowing that immigrant servants depended heavily on their wages to sustain loved ones across the ocean. This dependence deepened the silent contract of loyalty, binding Irish women to households where their presence was vital yet undervalued. The experience of Irish servants was shaped by prejudice as much as by necessity. The term Bridget became a stereotype for the Irish maid, a caricature used in newspapers, cartoons, and popular culture. Bridgets were depicted as clumsy, ignorant, or foolish, their identities reduced to a single demeaning label. This stereotype reflected the xenophobia of the period, when Irish immigrants faced hostility from native-born Americans who saw them as unskilled and inferior. Yet behind the stereotype lay the reality of women who endured grueling labor, long hours, and constant scrutiny to sustain the very households that mocked them. Other immigrant groups followed similar paths. German immigrants, arriving in large numbers after the failed revolutions of 1848, found work in kitchens and stables. Many Germans brought with them culinary skills, and German cooks became highly valued in some elite households. Scandinavians, particularly Swedes and Norwegians, also entered domestic service in the late 19th century. Their reputations for cleanliness and discipline made them desirable hires, especially in the Midwest and northern cities. Italians and Eastern Europeans, arriving in even larger numbers after 1880, often filled positions as coachmen, gardeners, or lower-ranking staff. Ellis Island, opened in 1892, became the gateway for these new waves of workers. For many immigrants, their first steps onto American soil led quickly to domestic service. Agencies in New York City matched newly arrived women with households seeking maids or cooks. Notices in newspapers advertised the availability of immigrant labor, and word of mouth spread among servants already employed. The demand for domestic workers was so high that many found work almost immediately upon arrival. But the reality of that work was sobering. Immigrants entered mansions where their labor was essential but their presence invisible, their futures tied to employers who could dismiss them without warning. The racial and ethnic dimensions of this labor force reveal the broader inequalities of the Gilded Age. While European immigrants dominated domestic roles in the Northeast and Midwest, African American men and women often filled similar positions in the South and in cities like Washington, D.C. Their experiences were shaped by the legacy of slavery, as white families frequently viewed their service through a lens of racial hierarchy. For black domestic workers, the bonds of loyalty and discipline were burdened by deeper prejudices, limiting their opportunities for advancement. Their presence in wealthy households reinforced both the continuity of labor systems after emancipation and the racial divisions that defined American society. Immigrant servants lived at the intersection of opportunity and exploitation. For many, service was a temporary stage, a way to save money, learn English, and eventually pursue other paths. Diaries and letters reveal how young women often left service after several years to marry, open small businesses, or seek factory jobs with greater independence. Yet for others, the servants' life stretched across decades. The butlers, cooks, and housekeepers who remained in service often did so because they found stability, or because opportunities outside remained scarce. Their stories complicate the narrative of upward mobility, reminding us that the American dream was unevenly distributed. The bond between immigrant servants and their employers varied widely. Some mistresses relied heavily on their Irish maids, forming relationships of trust that lasted years. Others treated their staff with disdain, seeing them as disposable. Cultural clashes were common, Irish Catholics working for Protestant families, or German servant preparing foods unfamiliar to Anglo-American palates. These tensions reflected the broader anxieties of a rapidly changing nation, where immigration transformed not only the workforce but the very fabric of society. For immigrant servants, adaptation was a form of resilience. They learned the customs of elite households, mastered the rituals of dining and dress, and navigated the complex hierarchies below stays. In doing so, they carved out spaces of agency. Servants built communities of their own, gathering in kitchens, laundries, or boarding houses to share stories, advice, and support. Churches and immigrant associations provided networks of assistance, helping servants find work or confront exploitation. These communities became lifelines, sustaining workers through the isolation of domestic service. The presence of immigrants in domestic service also shaped American culture. The foods they cooked, the traditions they carried, and the languages they spoke filtered subtly into the households they served. German cooks introduced new recipes, Irish maids brought songs and stories, and Scandinavian servants influenced the aesthetics of cleanliness and order. Even as employers sought to erase their individuality through uniforms and discipline, immigrant servants left traces of their cultures within the very households that sought to conceal them. British Empire, fall of the British Empire, decline of the British Empire, World War I history, World War II history, how empires fall, rise and fall of empires, colonial history, decolonization, history of India independence, Suez Crisis Explained, British Empire Documentary, History Documentary 2024, Global History, Military History, Empire Collapse, World War History, Fall of Great Powers, Decline of Britain, World War I Documentary, World War II Documentary, Britain After World War II, History of, Colonialism, End of the British Empire, Why the British Empire Collapsed, Britain's Decline. The Gilded Age glittered with images of wealthy women in gowns embroidered with gold thread, jewels catching the light of chandeliers, and society hostesses commanding attention in ballrooms that rivaled European palaces. Yet behind these visible figures were other women, unseen, uncelebrated, and indispensable. The majority of domestic servants in the Gilded Age were women. They scrubbed, stitched, and polished. They cared for children, prepared meals, and maintained the endless work of luxury. Their lives were lived in the shadows of the families they served, their identities defined not by their own ambitions but by the demands of others. To understand the Gilded Age fully, we must look closely at these women in shadows, whose labor sustained an entire way of life. Domestic service had long been considered women's work. In 19th century America, expectations about gender shaped every corner of the household. Men dominated public life, while women were associated with the private sphere of the home. But in the grand mansions of the Gilded Age, this ideology was turned upside down. The home was no longer a modest, private retreat. It was a stage for public performance, with dinners, receptions, and balls that projected wealth and power. To keep this stage flawless, elite women relied on armies of other women, cooks, laundresses, parlor maids, seamstresses, governesses, and nursemaids, whose invisible labor kept the illusion intact. Census records from 1880 and 1900 confirmed the scale of this female workforce. In cities like New York and Boston, Irish women made up the majority of domestic servants, followed by Germans, Swedes, and later Italians and Eastern Europeans. African American women, particularly in the South and in Washington, D.C., also filled countless positions as maids, cooks, and nannies. For these women, service was often the only accessible form of employment. Factories, offices, and professional careers were largely closed to them. Domestic service, despite its long hours and low pay, provided stability, food, and lodging. The range of women's roles in service reflected the hierarchies of both class and gender. At the top stood the housekeeper and the lady's maid. The housekeeper was a formidable figure, often older, with years of experience. She managed the female staff, kept accounts, ordered supplies, and maintained the household's order. Employers relied heavily on her competence, granting her authority that few women outside domestic service could claim. The lady's maid, meanwhile, occupied an intimate role, caring for the mistress's wardrobe, hair, and personal needs. She knew her employer's secrets, fears, and vanities, and her discretion was invaluable. These women stood closest to power, yet their authority was borrowed, dependent entirely on the goodwill of their employers. Lower down the hierarchy were the housemaids, parlor maids, and kitchen maids who performed the bulk of daily labor. They scrubbed marble floors, polished silver, and dusted endless surfaces. Parlor maid kept the drawing rooms ready for visitors, arranging flowers and lighting fires. Kitchen maids assisted cooks, their hands raw from constant washing and chopping. Laundresses, often working in stifling rooms filled with steam, washed and ironed mountains of clothing and linens. Their work was invisible unless it failed. A mist stain, a wrinkled dress, or a dusty mantelpiece could bring reprimand. For these women, perfection was not a choice but a requirement. The work was grueling, but the conditions of women in service were shaped as much by gender as by labor. Female servants were particularly vulnerable to exploitation. Harassment by male employers or by higher-ranking male staff was a reality, though rarely recorded in official documents. Silence was often the only protection, as speaking out risked dismissal and disgrace. Historians studying court records and personal letters have uncovered instances where servants faced unwanted advances or abuse, the lack of power leaving them with little recourse. This hidden vulnerability was part of what it meant to live as a woman in shadows. For African American women, the burden was even heavier. After emancipation, many found work as domestic servants in white households, particularly in the South. They endured not only the harsh conditions of service, but also the racial hierarchies that persisted after slavery. Employers often assumed loyalty and obedience, while opportunities for advancement were almost non-existent. Their presence in Gilded Age households reveals a persistence of racial inequality, even as the nation proclaimed freedom and opportunity. Immigrant women, too, bore the weight of prejudice. Irish maids were mocked in cartoons as Bridgets, while Italian and Eastern European women were seen as ignorant or unrefined. Employers sometimes expressed open disdain, even as they relied on their labor. Yet these women demonstrated resilience. Many used domestic service as a stepping stone, saving wages to support families, fund siblings' education, or prepare for marriage. In letters sent home, they spoke of the difficulties of service, but also of the pride in supporting loved ones across oceans. Their sacrifices helped build the foundations of immigrant communities in America. The paradox of women in service lay in their invisibility and indispensability. They were expected to move silently, to be present without being seen. A perfectly kept room, a flawless dinner service, or a polished gown all testified to their skill. Yet the women behind the labor were rarely acknowledged. In society columns, the names of hostesses and guests filled pages, while the servants who enabled their splendor were omitted entirely. The silence of history mirrors the silence demanded in their lives. Yet glimpses of their humanity emerge in the fragments left behind. In servant memoirs, diaries, and letters, women spoke of exhaustion, loneliness, and a longing for independence. They described friendships formed in kitchens, rivalries between staff, and the small joys of shared meals in the servants' hall. These accounts reveal a world rich with its own dynamics, where women created communities even within the constraints of servitude. Their resilience shines through the shadows cast by wealth. The bonds between mistresses and maids were especially complex. On the one hand, intimacy could breed trust. A lady's maid might know her employer better than anyone else, sharing moments of vulnerability and confidence. On the other hand, the relationship was deeply unequal, shaped by power and dependence. Employers often claimed affection for their maids, but the affection was conditional, disappearing the moment loyalty wavered. Maids, in turn, sometimes felt a mix of attachment and resentment, recognizing both the humanity and the hypocrisy of their mistresses. Children often formed deeper bonds with nursemaids and governesses than with their own parents. In wealthy families where social obligations kept mothers occupied, servants became constant caregivers. Children sometimes recalled their nursemaids with affection well into adulthood, acknowledging the role these women played in their upbringing. Yet these bonds rarely altered the servants' positions. When children grew up, the women who had cared for them often faded into the background, replaced by new staff or dismissed when their usefulness ended. By the early 20th century, the presence of women in service began to decline. Industrialization opened new opportunities, from factory work to office jobs, that offered greater independence and higher wages. Women increasingly left domestic service, seeking lives outside the shadows of elite households. Employers complained of servant shortages, lamenting the decline of loyalty and discipline. But the change reflected a broader shift in society, as women demanded more control over their labor and their futures. The women who lived in shadows during the Gilded Age left an indelible mark on history, even if their names are largely forgotten. Their labor sustained the illusion of effortless wealth, their silent protected reputations, and their sacrifices built foundations for future generations. They remind us that history is not only made by the visible figures in ballrooms and boardrooms, but also by those who worked unseen, shaping daily life in ways both profound and enduring. The story of these women is a story of invisibility and resilience. It is a reminder that the grandeur of the Gilded Age, so often celebrated in memory, was constructed on the backs of women whose own lives were confined to attics, kitchens, and back staircases. They were women in shadows, but without them, the light of the Gilded Age would never have shone so brightly. In the grand halls of Gilded Age mansions, appearances mattered more than almost anything else. The gleam of polished silver, the shine of marble floors, the glitter of diamonds in the ballroom, all were part of a carefully constructed image of refinement. But one of the most powerful symbols of this image was not made of gold or stone. It was cloth. Servants' uniforms, stitched from cotton, wool, and silk, carried meanings far beyond their material. They were visual markers of hierarchy, symbols of invisibility, and tools of discipline. To the families they served, uniforms projected order and status. To the servants who wore them, they stripped individuality while binding them to the identity of the household. Uniforms had long been part of domestic service in Europe, particularly in Britain, where aristocratic households employed strict dress codes to staff. American elites of the Gilded Age, eager to imitate European traditions, adopted the same practices. In mansions along New York's Fifth Avenue and in Newport summer palaces, servants were outfitted in clothing that reinforced hierarchy and spectacle. Every detail of a uniform, its color, cut, and material, spoke a language understood by both employers and guests. At the top of this artorial hierarchy stood the butler. His uniform, usually a black tailcoat with a white shirt and bow tie, symbolized dignity and control. The butler's dress blurred the line between servant and master, echoing the attire of the gentleman of the house but stripped of ornament. He was visible in moments of formality, greeting guests, serving wine, orchestrating banquets, and his uniform signaled authority over the staff beneath him. To wear the butler's coat was to embody responsibility, loyalty, and discretion. Footmen, by contrast, were dressed to dazzle. Their livery often mirrored military uniforms, with bright colors, brass buttons, and white gloves. In some households, livery was chosen to reflect family crests or European traditions, emphasizing lineage and refinement. Tall, well-built young men were preferred as footmen, their uniform transforming them into living symbols of aristocratic display. When they stood behind chairs at dinner or opened carriage doors, their uniforms reinforced a spectacle of wealth. Guests understood instinctively that a household that could afford multiple footmen in elaborate livery was one of immense means. For maids, uniform conveyed invisibility rather than spectacle. Housemaids typically wore plain black dresses with starched white aprons and caps. The simplicity of their attire emphasized modesty, cleanliness, and subordination. Unlike footmen, maids were not meant to stand out. Their uniforms rendered them part of the background, blending into the architecture they maintained. Parlor maids, who sometimes interacted with guests, wore slightly more refined versions of this uniform, while kitchen maids and scullery maids often wore older, plainer garments suitable for grueling labor. The uniform reinforced hierarchy even within the servant class. The quality of fabric and the cut of the dress revealed one's rank as clearly as any title. Ladies' maids and governesses occupied ambiguous positions, reflected in their clothing. A lady's maid often dressed in dark, respectable gowns, similar in quality to her mistresses but without the embellishments of fashion. This attire allowed her to move between the private and public spheres of the household, assisting in personal matters while maintaining a professional identity. Governesses, often educated women from middle-class backgrounds, were expected to dress with modest refinement. Their clothing distinguished them from lower-ranking servants, but also reminded them that they were not equals of the family they served. In every case, attire became a visible marker of position, drawing boundaries between roles. Uniforms were also a form of control. By dictating what servants wore, employers reinforced authority over their bodies and identities. Uniforms erased individuality, making servants interchangeable components of the household machine. A maid in a black dress and cap was not Bridget or Anna or Mary. She was a maid. The sameness of attire signaled subordination and emphasized that servants were defined not by personal character but by function. Employers often required uniforms to be kept spotless, with maids laundering their own garments and presenting themselves in perfect order. Any deviation risked reprimand. The symbolism of uniforms extended to interactions with the outside world. When servants accompanied employers on outings, their attire projected status. A coachman in livery driving a carriage announced wealth as clearly as the carriage itself. A maid in uniform shopping for provisions reminded onlookers of the household size and refinement. Uniforms thus carried meanings beyond the mansion walls, broadcasting the family's social position to the city at large. For servants, this visibility was double-edged. Uniforms offered protection in public, signaling employment in a respectable household, but also reinforced their subordination, marking them as workers even outside the house. Cultural stereotypes attached themselves to these uniforms. The Bridget caricature of the Irish maid often depicted her in cap and apron, while cartoons mocking elite households exaggerated the livery of footmen to lampoon excess. These images reveal how deeply the symbolism of uniforms penetrated the public imagination. They were not just clothing. They were visual shorthand for wealth, inequality, and the invisible world of service. Despite their restrictive meanings, uniforms sometimes offered servants opportunities. A well-kept uniform could inspire pride, signaling competence and professionalism. For butlers and housekeepers, uniforms distinguished them as leaders within the servant hierarchy, commanding respect both above and below stays. Some servants use their appearance to negotiate better terms, emphasizing loyalty and dignity through immaculate presentation. In this sense, the language of uniforms was not only imposed from above, it was also interpreted and reshaped by those who wore them. The discipline of uniforms also reveals broader gender dynamics. Male servants in livery were presented as symbols of spectacle, while female servants in aprons were meant to fade into invisibility. This contrast reflected wider social norms, where women's labor was expected to be unseen, modest, and silent. The uniform became an extension of this ideology, embedding cultural expectations directly into clothing. The same fabric that projected refinement for the household reinforced subordination for the women who wore it. By the early 20th century, as domestic service declined, the elaborate system of uniforms began to fade. Families reduced the size of their staffs, and middle-class households often employed only a single maid, whose attire was practical rather than symbolic. The spectacle of footmen in livery or butlers in tailcoats gradually disappeared, preserved only in photographs and memoirs. Yet the legacy of uniforms endures in the way they shape perceptions of class and labor. Even today, uniforms in hotels, restaurants, and domestic work echo the traditions of the Gilded Age, carrying forward a language of hierarchy and service. The story of uniforms in the Gilded Age is not about fabric alone. It is about power, visibility, and identity. For the wealthy, uniform projected order, discipline, and refinement. For servants, they raise individuality while binding them to the households they sustained. Every stitch and seam spoke of hierarchy, every apron and livery reinforced the spectacle of wealth. To wear a uniform in the Gilded Age was to embody the contradictions of the era itself. Visible yet invisible, indispensable yet overlooked, dignified yet subordinate. The grandeur of the Gilded Age mansion rested on silence and discipline upstairs, but below stairs the atmosphere was far different. In the kitchens, laundries, and servant halls, voices filled the air. Conversations overlapped with the clatter of pots, the hiss of steam, and the steady rhythm of brooms on marble floors. For servants, these hidden spaces were more than workplaces. They were gathering grounds, where stories were exchanged, grievances shared, and bonds forged. Out of sight of the families they served, servants created their own networks of communication and solidarity, informal systems that shaped their survival, resilience, and sometimes even quiet resistance. In the rigidly stratified world of the Gilded Age household, communication among servants was both necessary and inevitable. The sheer scale of operations in mansions like the Vanderbilt's Breakers or George Washington Vanderbilt II's Biltmore estate required constant coordination. Meals had to be prepared and served with precision, linens rotated and washed, fires lit and maintained, rooms polished and restored, horses groomed, and carriages readied, all without disrupting the illusion of effortless luxury upstairs. This demanded cooperation among dozens of workers. Servants relied on one another not only to complete tasks, but also to anticipate the rhythms of the household. Networks emerged organically. Kitchen staff signaling to footmen when courses were ready, made coordinating schedules to clean rooms before family or guests returned. Coachmen timing arrivals with the butler's instructions. Beneath the hierarchy, a web of communication held the system together. But these networks went beyond efficiency. They were also social lifelines. Many servants were immigrants, isolated from families in Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, or Italy. Their days stretched from dawn to midnight, leaving little opportunity to form friendships outside the house. Within kitchens and servants' halls, they found companionship. Shared meals at long wooden tables became moments of relief, where laughter and gossip replaced the silence demanded upstays. Oral histories and memoirs of former servants describe these gatherings as essential to morale. They allowed workers to vent frustrations, trade news, and maintain a sense of identity separate from their roles. Gossip was a currency of these networks. Servants overheard everything: arguments between spouses, indiscretions at parties, financial worries, and social rivalries. Kitchens buzzed with whispered reports of what had been seen or heard in drawing rooms and corridors. While discretion was demanded in public, in private servants shared information freely. Gossip served multiple purposes. It was entertainment in otherwise monotonous lives, but it was also a tool for survival. Knowledge of an employer's habits or moods could help servants avoid mistakes. Awareness of household tensions allowed them to navigate their roles more carefully. Information gave workers a measure of control, even in a system designed to render them powerless. These networks extended beyond single households. Servants communicated across city blocks, neighborhoods, and even states. On days off, they met in parks, churches, or boarding houses, exchanging stories of their employers and conditions. Employment agencies, which connected immigrants to households, became hubs of information, with workers warning one another about difficult families or poor pay. Word spread quickly about households to avoid or employers who treated staff well. This informal system of reviews gave servants some agency in choosing or leaving positions. For immigrant communities, these networks provided essential support. Letters sent back to Ireland or Germany often included descriptions of households, allowing new arrivals to prepare for the realities of service. Religion and ethnic identity strengthened these connections. Irish servants often gathered in Catholic churches, where priests provided both spiritual guidance and practical assistance. German and Scandinavian servants formed mutual aid societies, offering financial help or job leads to one another. African American domestic workers, particularly in cities like Washington, D.C., relied on church networks for solidarity and protection. These communities extended the servant networks beyond the household walls, embedding them in the larger fabric of immigrant and working-class life. Servant networks were not only about camaraderie, they were also spaces of subtle resistance. While outright defiance was rare, servants sometimes used their collective strength to push back against unreasonable demands. If an employer became abusive or failed to pay wages on time, word could spread quickly through the servant grapevine, making it difficult for that family to hire new staff. In some cases, groups of servants left positions together, creating crises for households suddenly left without support. These quiet acts of solidarity demonstrated the hidden power of networks, even within systems designed to suppress autonomy. The kitchen, in particular, was a symbolic center of these networks. It was the one place in the house where noise was tolerated, where conversations could rise above whispers. Kitchens were often physically separated from the formal dining rooms, located in basements or service wings. This distance created a sense of freedom. In memoirs, servants described kitchens as spaces where laughter, singing, and storytelling flourished, even amid hard labor. The kitchen became a world of its own, chaotic, noisy, and alive, a counterpoint to the silent, polished rooms upstairs. Networks also crossed lines of hierarchy. Those strict divisions separated butlers from scullery maids, or governesses from footmen. Necessity often blurred these boundaries. A sympathetic housekeeper might shield a maid from punishment, or a butler might quietly adjust duties to ease a burden on overworked staff. Friendships developed across ranks, softening the rigidity of the system. At the same time, rivalries and tensions existed, with gossip sometimes fueling conflict. But the very existence of these interactions reveals that beneath the formal order of the household, a hidden web of human relationships thrived. Beyond practical and emotional support, servant networks shaped identity. For many workers, life in service was isolating, demanding constant subordination. Networks reminded them of their humanity. Stories, songs, and shared traditions preserved cultural ties. Irish maids sang folk songs in kitchens, German cooks shared recipes, Scandinavian housemaids celebrated holidays together. These practices kept alive connections to home while forging new identities in America. In this way, servant networks were not only mechanisms of survival but also acts of cultural continuity and adaptation. By the early 20th century, as domestic service declined, these networks began to weaken. Smaller staff reduced opportunities for collective interaction, while industrial jobs drew workers into factories where different forms of solidarity emerged. Yet the legacy of these networks remains. They reveal the hidden lives of servants, the communities they built in the shadows, and the quiet ways they asserted agency in systems designed to deny it. The grandeur of the Gilded Age could not exist without silence upstays, but it also depended on the noise downstays. The whispers in kitchens, the conversations in laundries, the songs in servant halls. These were the sounds of resilience. They were the threads of connection that allowed workers to endure long hours, heavy labor, and invisibility. They remind us that history is not only written in marble and gold, but also in the words exchanged in kitchens, passed hand to hand, voice to voice, across the hidden world of servants. The Gilded Age projected an image of elegance and stability. Newspapers chronicled lavish balls, society hostesses appeared in gowns imported from Paris, and financiers posed as modern aristocrats whose power seemed untouchable. Yet behind the closed doors of their marble mansions, another story unfolded, one hidden from public eye, but visible to the servants who moved silently through the halls. In the kitchens, corridors, and staircases, whispers carried tales of secrets, scandals, and intrigue. Servants became the unseen witnesses of the private lives of America's wealthiest families, guardians of reputations, but also keepers of the truths that could have shattered them. The very structure of domestic service made such knowledge inevitable. Servants lived in constant proximity to their employers. They dressed them in the morning, served them at meals, tidied their rooms, and walked the corridors late at night when the family slept. Their presence was both invisible and intimate. They overheard quarrels between spouses, witnessed indiscretions at midnight, and saw the unguarded moments when the polished image of the elite cracked. The discipline of silence ensured that most of these stories never left the household. But within kitchens and servants' halls, the truth circulated freely. Affairs were among the most common scandals whispered about below stays. The rigid social codes of the Gilded Age emphasized propriety, but wealth and leisure provided ample opportunity for transgression. Servants often knew before anyone else when a mistress entertained a lover in secret, or when a master engaged in affairs with women outside the household. Sometimes the boundaries blurred even further, with employers taking advantage of the power imbalance to pursue relationships with female staff. These situations, rarely recorded in official histories, were part of the hidden reality of service. Stories whispered quietly, their truth known only to those in shadows. Financial scandals also unfolded within the walls of Gilded Age mansions. Families who projected stability often concealed precarious finances. Servants handling household accounts or overhearing conversations might become aware of debts, investments gone wrong, or disputes over inheritances. In an era when fortune could rise and fall quickly, the image of permanence was everything. Servants, through their proximity, became unwilling witnesses to the fragility behind the facade. In some cases, disgruntled staff leaked information to newspapers, feeding the sensational press that thrived on stories of the rich. More often, they kept their silence, bound by the unwritten contract of loyalty, but burdened with knowledge of the instability hidden behind closed doors. There were also darker stories. Theft was a constant fear in households filled with valuables. Servants had access to jewelry, silver, and fine clothing, and while many remained loyal, others succumbed to temptation. Court records from New York and Boston in the late 19th century reveal cases of servants accused of stealing from their employers, sometimes pawning items to support families in poverty. Newspapers reported these incidents with relish, reinforcing stereotypes of servants as untrustworthy. Yet the reality was more complex. Most theft was small: food taken from kitchens, coal carried home for warmth, or clothing repurposed, acts of survival rather than betrayal. Still, the fear of scandal kept employers vigilant, locking valuables away and watching their staff with suspicion. Blackmail, though rarer, carried even greater risk. The knowledge servants held could destroy reputations if revealed. Gossip in kitchens was one thing, a leak to the press was another. In some cases, former servants, embittered by dismissal or poor treatment, threatened to expose secrets. Employers responded harshly, pursuing legal action or using wealth to silence threats. These incidents highlight the precarious balance of trust. Servants were indispensable, yet the power they held through knowledge made them dangerous. Employers depended on their silence as much as on their labor. Even when not scandalous, the secret servants carried revealed the contradictions of Gilded Age life. They saw the gap between the image families projected and the reality within. They knew when a hostess wore jewels rented from a dealer, or when a grand dinner was financed by borrowed money. They witnessed the exhaustion behind constant social performances, the loneliness of children raised by governesses, and the tensions between family members competing for status. These truths rarely appeared in society pages, but they formed a hidden reality beneath the glittering surface. One of the most striking examples of scandal involved the 1892 murder of millionaire William Marsh Rice, founder of Rice University. While not a domestic servant, his valet Charles Jones conspired and plot, forging documents to gain access to Rice's fortune. The case shocked the public, not only for the crime itself, but for what it revealed about the vulnerabilities of the wealthy. A servant, privy to private documents and routines, could exploit his position in ways unthinkable in the rigid world of aristocratic control. The scandal underscored the delicate balance of trust upon which elite households relied. The press of the Gilded Age thrived on exposing such stories. Newspapers like the New York World and the New York Herald eagerly reported on scandals among the wealthy, feeding public fascination with the lives of the elite. Servants rarely appeared by name in these accounts, but their unseen presence was always implied. They were the eyes and ears, the silent witnesses whose knowledge made such reporting possible. In some cases, journalists cultivated relationships with staff, trading money for information. While most servants maintained silence, the temptation to expose secrets for financial gain was never absent. Yet beyond scandals, the very existence of secrecy reveals something deeper about the Gilded Age. The system of domestic service created an environment where truth was constantly concealed. Families concealed their weaknesses from society, and servants concealed their knowledge from families. The entire structure depended on layers of silence and discretion. Scandals were the cracks in this system, moments when hidden realities surfaced and the illusion of effortless grandeur collapsed. The stories of secrets and scandals remind us that the Gilded Age was not only a time of opulence but also of fragility. The glittering image of wealth was always precarious, sustained by silence, discipline, and the invisible labor of those who knew the truth. Servants, though unseen, were at the center of this system. They were the keepers of secrets, the custodians of reputations, and sometimes the agents of scandal. Their position in households gave them access to truths that could never be spoken but were always present, whispered in kitchens and corridors, hidden behind closed doors. The glittering facade of the Gilded Age concealed not only the labor of servants, but also the immense physical and emotional cost of their work. While elite families displayed wealth with effortless grace, the men and women who made that illusion possible carried burdens that scarred their bodies and shaped their lives. Servants lived within a culture of silence, forbidden to speak of what they saw, discouraged from voicing grievances, and conditioned to endure without complaint. This silence compounded the toll of their labor, leaving behind a hidden history of exhaustion, illness, and hardship. The physical demands of domestic service were relentless. A single mansion could contain dozens of rooms, each requiring daily cleaning. Housemaids spent hours scrubbing marble floors, polishing woodwork, and dusting chandeliers that hung far above their reach. Coal had to be hauled to keep fires burning. Heavy water buckets were carried up and down narrow back staircases before the arrival of indoor plumbing. Laundry maids worked in steam-filled rooms, bent over tubs and wringers, lifting heavy linens that weighed more when wet. Scullery maids washed mountains of grease pans, their hands raw from constant exposure to hot water and soap. Each task was demanding in isolation, but together they created a cycle of physical strain that left servants perpetually fatigued. Accidents were common. Burns from stoves, cuts from knives, and falls on narrow staircases filled with coal dust were part of daily life. Medical care was minimal, especially for immigrant servants with little money or access to doctors. Employers often dismissed servants who became injured or ill, replacing them with healthy workers rather than bearing the cost of treatment. For many, an injury meant not only pain but also the loss of employment, housing, and stability. Servants lived in constant fear that illness would render them disposable. The long hours compounded these hardships. Servants typically rose before dawn and worked until midnight, with little rest in between. While elite families entertained guests at glittering dinners, servants stood silently for hours, serving and clearing dishes, then returning to kitchens to scrub pots into the early morning. Few had more than half a day off each week. The physical toll of such schedules was staggering. Letters and diaries from servants describe aching backs, sleepless nights, and the weariness that came from endless repetition. For many women, the demands of service accelerated aging, leaving them physically worn long before their time. Beyond physical strain, servants endured deep emotional and psychological hardship. Silence was one of the most powerful tools of discipline in Gilded Age households. Servants were expected to remain invisible, to be present without being noticed, to witness without speaking, to hear without repeating. They became custodians of secrets, carrying the weight of knowledge they could not share. This silence was isolating. Workers could not confide in employers for fear of dismissal, and even among fellow servants, discretion limited what could be said. Over time, the pressure to remain silent created emotional distance, turning many into observers of lives they could never fully join. Loneliness was a constant companion. Servants lived apart from their families, often separated by oceans. Many were young women from Ireland, Germany, or Scandinavia who had left behind parents and siblings to seek opportunity in America. Their only contact came through letters, which could take weeks or months to arrive. In the meantime, they lived in attic rooms or basement dormitories, their lives confined to the walls of the households they served. While camaraderie existed in kitchens and servant halls, the constant pressure of work left little time for genuine connection. For many, the isolation of service was as heavy a burden as the physical labor itself. Women bore the brunt of these hardships. Female servants not only performed the majority of domestic tasks, but also endured particular vulnerabilities. Harassment by male employers or higher-ranking male staff was an unspoken reality. Few women could report such behavior without risking dismissal, and most had no legal recourse. Pregnancies outside of marriage often meant immediate dismissal, leaving women destitute. Some sought refuge in charitable homes for unwed mothers. Others disappeared into poverty. The silence surrounding these experiences reflects the broader invisibility of women in service, their suffering rarely recorded, their voices absent from the histories of the Gilded Age. Mental strain was another hidden cost. The constant subordination, the suppression of individuality, and the demand for perfection took a psychological toll. Servants were expected to anticipate needs, endure scolding, and accept criticism without protest. Mistakes, a broken dish, a late service, a misstain, could bring humiliation or dismissal. Over time, the lack of autonomy eroded confidence. Servants internalized the idea that their worth lay in obedience and silence, shaping identities marked by subordination. Some broke under the strain, leaving service abruptly or falling into despair. These personal struggles rarely appear in records, yet they were as much a part of the Gilded Age household as the grandeur above. Health hazards extended beyond the house itself. Many servants lived in overcrowded urban tenements when not residing in their employers' homes. Poor sanitation, polluted water, and infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, typhoid, and influenza spread rapidly in these environments. Domestic workers, moving between wealthy households and crowded neighborhoods, were especially vulnerable. Their employers enjoyed clean water, fresh food, and access to medical care, but servants carried the risks of the city into their own lives. For immigrant women, the dual exposure of service and poverty created a precarious existence where illness was a constant threat. Despite these hardships, resilience shone through. Servants found ways to cope with the toll of their labor. In kitchens and laundries, they shared laughter and gossip, turning routine tasks into moments of connection. Churches and community organizations offered support, providing spiritual solace and practical aid. Some women saved wages to bring siblings to America, transforming hardship into opportunity for family members. Others used service as a stepping stone, enduring years of labor before leaving to marry, open small businesses, or pursue more independent work. Their endurance reflects both the harshness of their conditions and the strength with which they navigated them. The silence surrounding servants' hardships also reveals the broader inequalities of the Gilded Age. Wealthy families rarely acknowledge the toll of service. To do so would have disrupted the illusion of effortless grandeur. Instead, they cultivated a narrative of loyalty and devotion, imagining servants as content in their roles. This myth obscured the reality of exhaustion, illness, and vulnerability. It allowed elite households to sustain their image without reckoning with the human cost. The toll of silence was thus not only personal but cultural, a collective erasure of the suffering that sustained wealth. By the early 20th century, social reform began to expose these hidden hardships. Labor activists, journalists, and reformers drew attention to the conditions of domestic workers. Servant shortages, combined with new opportunities in factories and offices, forced employers to confront the decline of loyalty they had once taken for granted. The hardships that had been endured silently for decades began to surface in public discourse, challenging the myth of contented service. Yet the legacy of silence persisted, leaving much of the suffering of Gilded Age servants unrecorded. The story of the Gilded Age is incomplete without acknowledging the toll of silence. Behind the polished facades and glittering ballrooms lay a world of hardship carried on the backs of those whose labor was unseen and unspoken. Servants bore physical pain, emotional isolation, and social vulnerability, their struggles hidden by the very silence demanded of them. Their resilience deserves recognition, not as an afterthought but as central to the history of the age. Without them, the illusion of grandeur could not have existed. But the cost was measured in bodies broken by labor, voices silenced by discipline, and lives lived in shadows. For many servants of the Gilded Age, the endless rhythm of labor, the scrubbing, polishing, carrying, and waiting, was not simply a way of life. It was a stepping stone. Beneath the silence and discipline imposed on them lay a quiet but persistent hope that service was temporary and that a better future awaited beyond it. This dream beyond service shaped the decisions of thousands of men and women who passed through America's great households. Some realized it, some fell short, but for all, it was a guiding force that gave meaning to the grind of daily labor. Domestic service drew countless immigrants to America, particularly young women from Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia. Letters sent across the Atlantic often painted service as a temporary condition, an opportunity to save money, learn English, and build a foundation for independence. Parents encouraged daughters to go into service not as an end in itself, but as a beginning. For families devastated by famine in Ireland or political upheaval in Europe, the wages earned in American households represented both survival and possibility. Service, though demanding, provided food and lodging, which meant a greater portion of wages could be saved. These savings fueled dreams of marriage, of small businesses, of farms and homes that offered stability far from the kitchens and corridors of the wealthy. Marriage was one of the most common aspirations. Many women viewed domestic service as a temporary stage before starting families of their own. They endured years of work, sending money home and accumulating small savings before leaving to marry fellow immigrants, often laborers, tradesmen, or small shopkeepers. Census data from the late 19th century reveals that few women remained in service after the mid-30s. Most transitioned into family life, their years in service providing the dowries or household goods needed to begin anew. Though often unrecorded in history books, these transitions were profound. The silent labor of servants sustained not only elite households, but also the growth of immigrant families and communities across America. For others, the dream extended beyond marriage. Some used their savings to open boarding houses, laundries, or small shops, capitalizing on the skills learned in service. A maid who mastered cleaning, organization, and budgeting could apply those talents to managing a business. Cooks sometimes opened bakeries or restaurants, carrying recipes and techniques from elite kitchens into the wider market. These ventures offered independence, a chance to escape the invisibility of service and claim identities as entrepreneurs. Newspapers occasionally reported on such success stories, portraying them as proof of American opportunity. Yet for every servant who opened a business, many more lacked the resources or connections to make the leap. Education represented another dream. Some servants, particularly younger immigrants, saw service as a way to finance schooling. Night classes in English, accounting, or shorthand became common in cities like New York and Boston. Churches and settlement houses offered lessons that allowed servants to imagine futures as teachers, clerks, or nurses. These paths were difficult, requiring immense discipline after long days of labor, but they represented avenues of escape from lifelong service. The dream of education fueled resilience, even when the reality fell short. The dream beyond service was not limited to women. Male servants, coachmen, footmen, gardeners, and butlers also aspired to independence. Some saved wages to purchase land in rural areas, reflecting the enduring immigrant dream of farming one's own soil. Others pursued trades, leaving service to become carpenters, blacksmiths, or shopkeepers. For African American men in the South, domestic work was often one of the few available options after emancipation. Many viewed it as temporary, hoping to secure land or skilled labor positions that offered greater autonomy. Yet the barriers of racism and poverty often kept those dreams out of reach. For African American women, the dream beyond service carried even heavier obstacles. Domestic work was one of the only employment opportunities available, and leaving it behind was difficult. Still, some pursued education through black churches, schools, and mutual aid societies, striving to enter professions such as teaching or nursing. Their journeys reveal the intersection of race, gender, and class in shaping both hardship and hope. While many dreamed of leaving service, others sought advancement within it. A scullery maid might aspire to become a kitchen maid, then a cook. A housemaid could aim to become a parlor maid or even a housekeeper. These upward steps brought higher wages, more respect, and sometimes a degree of authority. For some, rising within the hierarchy of service was the most realistic dream. Long-serving butlers and housekeepers often secured pensions or legacies in wills, symbols of the trust they had built. Though still bound by service, they transformed loyalty into stability, carving out modest but secure lives. Dreams, however, often collided with harsh realities. Wages were low, and saving was difficult, especially for servants supporting families abroad. Illness, injury, or dismissal could derail plans instantly. Women who married sometimes found themselves back in poverty, their savings gone and their labor undervalued in marriage. Small businesses could fail, leaving former servants with little to fall back on. The dream beyond service was fragile, shaped by forces beyond individual control. Yet even when unfulfilled, it gave purpose to years of grueling labor. The pursuit of dreams also carried cultural significance. Immigrant servants used their earnings to bring siblings and relatives to America, financing chain migration that transformed entire communities. An Irish maid's wages might fund a brother's journey, who in turn found work as a laborer or policeman. These collective strategies turned individual dreams into communal advancement. Domestic service, though grueling, became a foundation for immigrant survival and growth in America. The Gilded Age elite rarely recognized these dreams. To them, servants were fixtures of the household, their ambitions irrelevant. Yet the reality was that every maid scrubbing silver, every coachman polishing carriages, carried hopes that stretched beyond the mansion walls. These hopes shaped the lives of immigrant families, the growth of neighborhoods, and the broader story of working-class America. By the early 20th century, new opportunities began to open. Factories, offices, and department stores offered jobs that were less isolating and sometimes better paid. Servants left households for positions as clerks, seamstresses, or shopgirls, eager to escape the discipline of service. The so-called servant problem of the 1910s reflected this shift. Wealthy families lamented the difficulty of finding loyal staff, while workers embraced opportunities beyond domestic labor. The dreams of servants, once confined to kitchens and laundries, expanded into new worlds of work and independence. The dream beyond service was not always realized, but it was always present. It shaped decisions, fueled endurance, and connected servants to the wider currents of immigration, community, and opportunity. It reminds us that the story of the Gilded Age is not only about the fortunes of the wealthy, but also about the aspirations of those who labored in their shadows. These dreams, whispered in kitchens and written in letters, carried servants through years of silence and hardship. They were fragile, often thwarted, but they were also powerful, proof that even in the most constrained lives, hope endured. By the turn of the 20th century, the grandeur of the Gilded Age still dazzled outsiders, but beneath the surface, fractures began to show. The glittering facade of wealth, the marble staircases, the endless banquets, the army of silent servants, was not as stable as it appeared. The very system that sustained the illusion of effortless refinement began to falter. Servants were leaving, new technologies were changing households, and public criticism of excess was mounting. What had once seemed permanent and unshakable was revealed to be fragile, a performance that could not last. The so-called servant problem emerged as one of the earliest cracks. By the 1890s and early 1900s, wealthy families across New York, Boston, and Chicago complained that it was becoming increasingly difficult to find and keep staff. Letters to newspapers and articles in magazines like The Atlantic documented employers lamenting the decline of loyalty among servants. Where once household could rely on a steady flow of Irish, German, and Scandinavian immigrants to fill kitchens and laundries, the tide was shifting. New waves of immigrants from Italy, Poland, and Eastern Europe brought workers less familiar with domestic service traditions. At the same time, factories, offices, and department stores offered jobs with shorter hours, greater independence, and higher wages. For many young women, scrubbing floors or sleeping in attic quarters was no longer the only option. The decline in available servants forced households to adapt. Families accustomed to dozens of staff struggled with smaller teams, redistributing labor or lowering expectations. Some turned to domestic employment agencies, which advertised new arrival from Ellis Island as replacements. Others raised wages or relaxed strict rules in an attempt to attract workers. Yet even with these measures, loyalty remained elusive. Servants increasingly viewed domestic work as temporary, a stepping stone rather than a lifelong career. The stability that had once defined households, with butlers or cooks serving the same family for decades, became less common. Technology accelerated these changes. The arrival of electricity, gas stoves, central heating, and plumbing reduced the need for constant manual labor. Electric lighting eliminated the task of trimming and cleaning oil lamps. Gas and electric stoves simplified cooking, while hot water systems reduced the burden of hauling buckets. Laundry machines, though still primitive, began to appear in wealthy homes by the 1910s. These innovations meant that tasks once requiring armies of servants could be handled by smaller staffs. While the wealthiest families still employed butlers, cooks, and maids, the need for dozens of housemaids, scullery maids, and whole boys declined. The automobile delivered another blow. Carriages, horses, and stables had required entire teams of grooms and coachmen. Automobiles, though initially expensive, reduced the number of staff needed for transportation. By the 1910s, chauffeurs replaced coachmen, and stables were converted into garages. This shift reflected not only technological progress, but also the erosion of traditions that had defined elite households. The symbols of refinement, footmen in livery, stables filled with horses, grand kitchens staffed by multiple cooks, began to fade. Cultural criticism also chipped away at the golden facade. Journalists of the Progressive Era exposed the inequalities behind Gilded Age wealth. Writers like Jacob Riis, in his 1890 work How the Other Half Lives, revealed the stark contrast between Fifth Avenue mansions and the crowded tenements of immigrant families. Social reformers pointed to the vast gap between rich and poor, questioning the morality of elite extravagance. The very banquets celebrated in newspapers became symbols of waste in a nation where millions lived in poverty. Servants, positioned between these worlds, embodied the contradiction. Their labor sustained the illusion of refinement, even as their own families often lived in poverty nearby. The cracks also appeared within households themselves. Families accustomed to rigid hierarchies found that smaller staff blurred lines of authority. With fewer servants, mistresses of the house sometimes performed tasks they had never done before, managing correspondence, supervising meals, or even engaging in light cleaning. This shift unsettled the culture of the elite. For decades, refinement had been defined by freedom from labor. To perform tasks themselves threatened their social identity. Complaints and society pages revealed this anxiety, as wealthy women lamented the difficulty of finding suitable help and the indignity of managing tasks once relegated to staff. For servants, these cracks brought both challenges and opportunities. On the one hand, smaller staff meant heavier workloads for those who remained. Without a full team of maids, individuals shouldered multiple roles, increasing exhaustion. On the other hand, the decline of rigid hierarchies allowed some servants greater flexibility. They could negotiate higher wages or leave positions more easily, knowing alternative employment awaited in factories or offices. The balance of power, though still unequal, began to shift slightly away from absolute dependence on employers. The decline of domestic service also reflected broader social transformations. Women's roles in society were changing. The suffrage movement gained momentum, and new career paths opened for middle and working-class women. Typists, telephone operators, nurses, and teachers represented alternatives to service. These jobs offered not only better conditions, but also a sense of independence and identity beyond the shadows of elite households. For many women, leaving service was part of a larger push for autonomy in an era of shifting gender roles. By the 1920s, the cracks had widened into fissures. The First World War accelerated social change, drawing men and women into new forms of labor and reducing the pool of domestic workers even further. The opulence of the Gilded Age began to look outdated in a modern world shaped by industry, urbanization, and reform. Wealthy families continued to host parties and maintain estates, but the illusion of effortless refinement no longer held the same cultural authority. Servants, once the invisible backbone of this world, became scarcer and more visible in their absence. The mansions themselves became monuments to a fading era. The Breakers, Biltmore, and other great estates remain today as historic sites, preserved for tourists. Visitors marveled at architecture, their ballrooms, their endless corridors. Yet in these empty spaces, the absence of servants is palpable. The hidden staircases, cramped dormitories, and kitchen stand as reminders of the labor that sustained the illusion. Without the servants, the grandeur appears hollow, a shell of its former life. The cracks in the golden facade were not temporary. They marked the end of an era. The story of these cracks is not one of collapse but of transformation. The Gilded Age elite adapted, but they could not preserve the system as it had existed. The decline of domestic service, the rise of technology, and the growth of criticism reshaped households and society. The illusion of permanence was revealed as temporary, dependent on fragile systems of labor and silence. Servants, though still marginalized, found new opportunities, and their absence altered the very structure of elite life. The Gilded Age is remembered for its grandeur, but its decline reminds us of its fragility. The cracks in the golden facade reveal that wealth, no matter how vast, rests on foundations that can shift. Behind the marble walls and velvet curtains, the system of domestic service was always precarious, sustained by immigration, discipline, and silence. When these conditions changed, the illusion could no longer be maintained. The cracks widened, the facade faded, and the age of great households staffed by invisible armies came to an end. The Gilded Age has long been remembered for its opulence, the mansions that rose like palaces, the banquets that rivaled royal courts, the names of Vanderbilt, Aestia, and Carnegie etched into the nation's memory. But the era's legacy is incomplete without the servants who sustained it. They were the invisible force that polished the marble, prepared the meals, and preserved the illusion of effortless wealth. Their labor, their silence, and their sacrifices shaped not only the households of the elite, but also the broader story of America's social, cultural, and economic transformation. Though their names rarely appear in history books, their legacy endures in ways both visible and unseen. The most direct legacy lies in the physical spaces that remain. Today, visitors touring Newport's Breakers or Chevil's Biltmore Estate marvel at their grandeur. Guides describe the Vanderbilt's lavish parties, the imported marble, the ornate ballrooms. But beneath these surfaces, the traces of servants are everywhere. Narrow back staircases, cramped attic rooms, and vast kitchens remind us of the hidden lives that sustain these estates. The bells and speaking tubes, the laundry rooms and servant halls, are monuments to a workforce that made luxury possible. These remnants reveal a dual history, one of wealth and excess, and another of endurance and invisibility. The legacy also lives in memory and culture. Servants left behind fragments of their experiences in letters, diaries, and oral histories. Irish maids wrote to families in County Cork and Galway, describing long hours but steady wages. African-American servants, particularly in the South, passed down stories of resilience within a system that often replicated racial hierarchies of the past. German and Scandinavian cooks and housemaids recorded recipes and traditions that blended with American practices. These narratives, scattered and often overlooked, form a counter-history to the glittering accounts of the elite. They remind us that the Gilded Age was not only about those who owned the mansions, but also about those who lived and worked within them unseen. The legacy of servants also shaped immigrant communities. Wages earned in service-financed chain migration, enabling families to join one another in America. A single maid's savings could pay for a brother's passage or a parent's survival back home. These sacrifices built the foundations of Irish, German, Italian, and Scandinavian neighborhoods in cities across the United States. Domestic service, though often temporary, was central to the immigrant experience, providing the foothold that allowed communities to grow. The resilience of these workers left a lasting imprint on America's demographic and cultural landscape. Cultural traditions carried through servants also influence American households. Recipes introduced by German or French cooks became staples in elite kitchens and later filtered into mainstream cuisine. Scandinavian maids' emphasis on cleanliness and order shaped standards of housekeeping. African American domestic workers infused Southern households with traditions of cooking, language, and music that endured long after the Gilded Age. Though largely invisible at the time, these cultural contributions became part of the nation's fabric, woven quietly into daily life. Another legacy lies in the history of labor itself. Domestic service was one of the largest sectors of employment for women in the late 19th century, and the challenges they faced highlighted issues that would become central to labor reform. The long hours, low wages, lack of privacy, and vulnerability to exploitation exposed the need for greater protections. Though formal unions for domestic workers were rare in the Gilded Age, the hardships endured laid the groundwork for later organizing efforts in the 20th century. Domestic workers' rights campaigns in the 1930s and beyond drew on a history of struggle that stretched back to the unseen servants of the Gilded Age. The decline of domestic service in the early 20th century also left a legacy of nostalgia and critique. Wealthy families lamented the servant problem, framing loyalty as a virtue lost to modernity. At the same time, reformers pointed to the decline of service as evidence of social progress. For workers, leaving service often symbolized liberation from an oppressive system. The tensions between these perspectives reflect the broader legacy of the Gilded Age, a moment remembered for both its grandeur and its inequality, both its spectacle and its silence. The legacy of servants is also visible in literature and media. While American culture often romanticized the Gilded Age elite, the figure of the servant has persisted in novels, plays, and films. Stories of butlers, maids, and cooks, often fictionalized, keep alive the memory of a class whose real lives were marked by discipline and invisibility. Even popular fascination with upstage downstage drama speaks to the enduring curiosity about the hidden world of service. Though often dramatized, these representations stem from the historical reality of the Gilded Age, when servants lived at the intersection of wealth and labor, privilege and hardship. Perhaps the most profound legacy of servants lies in the lessons their lives teach us about power and inequality. The Gilded Age elite projected permanence, but their world depended on fragile systems of labor sustained by vulnerable workers. Servants reveal the truth behind the illusion that wealth, no matter how vast, rests on the toil of others. Their invisibility reflects broader patterns in history, where the contributions of the working class are overshadowed by the stories of the powerful. To recover their legacy is to acknowledge the hidden foundations of American prosperity. Their legacy also calls attention to resilience. Despite long hours, isolation, and silence, servants built communities, preserved cultures, and pursued dreams beyond service. Their sacrifices fueled the growth of immigrant neighborhoods, supported families across oceans, and sustained a social order that demanded invisibility. Their resilience reminds us that history is not only about those who commanded, but also about those who endured. Today, as debates about inequality, labor, and dignity continue, the legacy of Gilded Age servants remains relevant. The dynamics of invisibility, silence, and exploitation echo in modern forms of domestic work around the world. The story of the Gilded Age servant is not just a relic of the past, but a mirror for the present, reminding us of the enduring struggles of workers whose contributions are essential but often unseen. The Gilded Age is remembered for its facades of marble and gold, but its true foundation was built in kitchens, laundries, and servants' quarters. The legacy of those who labored in silence is not one of grandeur but of endurance, resilience, and quiet transformation. Their lives shaped families, communities, and the nation itself. Without them, the illusion of the Gilded Age could not have existed. And without remembering them, our understanding of the era remains incomplete. The story of the Gilded Age is most often told in images of marble staircases, glittering chandeliers, and millionaires who built empires of steel, oil, and railroads. Names like Vanderbilt, A.A. Steer, and Carnegie dominate the narrative, their legacies enshrined in architecture, philanthropy, and the mythology of American wealth. But beneath the marble and gold was another story, one written in silence, carried in shadows, and largely erased from memory. It is a story of the unseen, the thousands of servants whose lives sustained the grandeur of an era but whose names rarely survive in the record. Servants were the invisible backbone of the Gilded Age household. Their hands scrubbed the marble, polished the silver, and carried the coal that kept mansions warm. Their voices whispered in kitchens and corridors, but upstairs they were expected to remain silent, to appear only when summoned and vanish just as quickly. They lived in attic rooms and basement dormitories, their lives confined to hidden staircases and narrow passageways. They witnessed everything yet remained unacknowledged, their labor essential but their identities effaced. To remember them is to confront the contradictions of the Gilded Age. The era projected permanence and prosperity, but it was built on fragile systems of labor that depended on silence, discipline, and invisibility. The grandeur of Newport's ballrooms and New York's Fifth Avenue palaces was an illusion, sustained by workers whose exhaustion and hardship were hidden from public view. Their invisibility was not accidental. It was designed into the very architecture of the mansion, encoded in uniforms, reinforced by rules of silence. To recover their history is to pull back the velvet curtains and reveal the machinery that powered America's golden age. The legacy of these unseen lives is not confined to the past. The dynamics of invisibility, exploitation, and inequality that define domestic service in the Gilded Age echo in the modern world. Around the globe, domestic workers continue to labor in conditions shaped by vulnerability, immigrants caring for children, cleaning homes, or supporting families while remaining largely unrecognized. The silence demanded of Gilded Age servants persists today in different forms, reminding us that their story is not only historical but enduring. Yet their resilience also endures. Servants of the Gilded Age built immigrant communities, preserved cultural traditions, and pursued dreams beyond service. They used meager wages to bring families across the Atlantic, to establish neighborhoods, to educate children, and to lay foundations for generations to come. Their sacrifices shaped the social fabric of America, even if their names rarely appeared in print. They remind us that history is not only written by those at the top, but also by those whose labor sustained societies from the shadows. Walking through preserved mansions of Newport or the Biltmore estate today, visitors marvel at the opulence of the Gilded Age. Yet the most haunting spaces are not the ballrooms or dining halls, but the hidden corridors, kitchens, and servant quarters. These rooms, often empty and silent, speak of lives lived in discipline and endurance. They are monuments not only to wealth, but also to the unseen labor that made wealth visible. To stand in those spaces is to feel the presence of those who once moved silently through them, carrying trays, stoking fires, or scrubbing floors long into the night. To remember the unseen is to challenge the selective memory of history. It is to acknowledge that the story of the Gilded Age cannot be complete without the voices of those who endured its hardships. Their invisibility was once demanded, but it need not continue in our memory. To tell their story is to honor their endurance, their resilience, and their quiet but essential place in the making of modern America. The Gilded Age has passed, its families dispersed, its fortunes transformed, but the lessons of its hidden history remain. Wealth, no matter how dazzling, rests on foundations of labor. Grandeur, no matter how enduring, is fragile when built in silence. And history, no matter how polished, is incomplete until it remembers the unseen. This is the final legacy of the Gilded Age servants, not just the work they performed, but a reminder they leave us that behind every facade of power and wealth lies another story, one of sacrifice and struggle waiting to be told. To remember them is to see the Gilded Age anew, not as a golden illusion, but as a human story of those who stood in shadows, but without whom the light could never have shone.